Growing up in Sonobe, a rural town northeast of Kyoto, Shigeru Miyamoto found himself fascinated by the exploration of the natural areas around his home. During one such excursion, Miyamoto happened upon a hole in the ground that he attempted to survey, but his vision was obscured by the darkness. The next day, he returned, armed with a lantern, and shimmied down the hole, finding himself in a cavern with multiple passageways leading into their own chambers. Exploring this cave captivated Miyamoto as he returned throughout the summer to gaze at the shadows on the wall created by the glow from his lantern. Over the years, this story has become part of the legend of Miyamoto, as it was a big influence on his future achievements. In the mid to late 1970s, toy company Nintendo entered the video game market with some arcade cabinets. Around the same time, Miyamoto was just getting his start at Nintendo after presenting some of his toy creations to President Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nintendo developed an arcade game called Radar Scope, which they had hoped would become a big hit in America, but unfortunately resulted in 2,000 unsold cabinets. After a few years on the job, Miyamoto was tasked with designing an arcade game to replace Radar Scope in those cabinets. His new game, titled Donkey Kong, ended up being a huge hit for Nintendo. After a few more arcade hits such as Donkey Kong Jr. and the original Mario Brothers, Nintendo started their work on a home console endeavor. In 1983, they released the Famicom in Japan, which was renamed to the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, in America. In the years prior, the video game industry had crashed in North America, but the NES revived the industry with Miyamoto's pack-in game called Super Mario Bros. In an attempt to continue the company's success, Nintendo was looking to create a launch title for the Japanese add-on to the Famicom called the Famicom Disk System. Miyamoto thought he should design a new game that fully exploited the advantages of the disk system. Miyamoto co-directed the new game with Takashi Tezuka, who directed games such as Devil World and the original Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2. The original concept differed greatly than the end product we received. He envisioned a game that allowed two players to create dungeons and explore each other's creations. Eventually, the game formed into a one-player experience that gave players a world to explore with dungeons hidden throughout. Takashi Tezuka based the design of the protagonist Link off of Disney's Peter Pan. The overworld was named Hyrule, and it was heavily inspired by Miyamoto's childhood adventures exploring the countryside. Miyamoto and his team had the concept down, but they didn't yet have a title for the game. Of course, the title of the game wasn't decided right at the beginning. I knew I wanted it to be The Legend of Something, but I had a hard time figuring out what that something was going to be. That's when the PR planner said, "Why don't you make a storybook for this game?" He suggested an illustrated story where Link rescues a princess who is a timeless beauty with classic appeal, and mentioned there's a famous American author whose wife's name is Zelda. How about giving that name to the Eternal Beauty? I couldn't get behind the book idea, but I really liked the name Zelda. I asked him if I could use it, and he said that would be fine. And that is where the title The Legend of Zelda was born. Koji Kondo, the renowned composer behind the music for Super Mario Bros., returned to compose music for this game. At the time, there weren't many games like The Legend of Zelda. While it took some game design conventions from old Atari classics like Adventure, it also incorporated plenty of original ideas that helped establish a new subgenre of the action-adventure game. Miyamoto said, "The Indiana Jones movies were out around that time. I wanted to bring that sense of adventure to a video game." Due to the capability of the Famicom Disk System, The Legend of Zelda was one of the first home console video games that let players save their progress, which is more akin to PC games of the age. This was helpful since the game was expansive and open-ended. After starting the game, the player is placed on a large map with no explicit instruction on what to do next and no arrow to point them in the right direction. After Link grabs his sword, it is up to the player to explore and to figure out what to do. Miyamoto's superiors at Nintendo tried to convince him to make the game more linear since playtesters would often get lost in the game. Miyamoto was stern on his idea though. He believed that various people playing the game would talk to each other, compare notes, share the secrets that they have found, and with their combined effort, Link's quest would be less daunting and more rewarding. The Legend of Zelda performed well enough to sell plenty of Famicom disk systems in Japan, but since the disk system didn't exist in North America, Nintendo faced some complications upon bringing the game overseas. To bring the game west, they needed to break the cartridge size barrier to allow for games with more data. To include a save system, they decided to add an internal RAM chip in the cartridge, along with its own battery to keep it alive. This save system would be the first of its kind, and it also became the standard for cartridge-based games that were too complicated for a password system. All of this was wrapped in an elusive, gold-painted cartridge, which made the game feel even more prized.
Did you see the latest Nintendo newsletter?
Whoa, nice graphics! I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played it yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System. It's the Legend of Zelda, and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. Octorok's Tektites levers too. But with your help, our hero pulls through. Yeah, go Link, yeah, get Zelda.
Awesome!
Upon release, the game was met with enough success that Nintendo quickly greenlit a sequel. Sequels were a funny thing for Nintendo back in the day. For example, the differences between Donkey Kong Jr. and its predecessor are quite substantial. The same can be said about Super Mario Bros. And the American Super Mario Bros. Too. Following suit, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link would also prove to be much different than the original Legend of Zelda, with Miyamoto taking on a producer role and Tezuka setting his sights on other projects. Taking over the director's chair was Tadashi Sugiyama. The Adventure of Link presented an overhead view while exploring the larger map, but would switch perspective into a side-scrolling style while exploring towns or dungeons, which was much more akin to the platforming genre. This also made combat feel a bit more robust and varied than it did in the original game. Zelda 2 also incorporated more RPG elements that were getting popular at the time. For example, the game included an experience point system that allowed players to upgrade their health or magic. The game also ditched the desolate wasteland of the original for a more lively world with towns the player could interact with, or at least attempt to interact with. Zelda 2 proved to be more difficult than the original game, including the introduction of what would become a fan favorite enemy, Dark Link. Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link performed quite well financially, although it did not reach the heights of the original game. History hasn't been kind to Zelda 2, as many view it as the black sheep of the series when compared to the original game and what would follow. With a 5-year-long gap between Zelda 2 on the NES and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past on the SNES, fans had to be patient for the third installment in the franchise. With that time, returning game director Takashi Tezuka and his team were able to develop a fully realized world bristling with atmosphere. From the moment that Link leaves his uncle's house and travels to Hyrule Castle in the rain, gamers knew that they were in for a true adventure that goes above and beyond what the previous two games had in store. A Link to the Past proved to be more narrative driven than the original games were. We gain a further understanding of the lore of Hyrule and the Triforce. The protagonist isn't the same Link we were accustomed to from the previous NES games. Instead, this is a new generation of Link, arguably equipped with pink hair. From here on out, the series plays with the idea that Link and Zelda are reincarnated multiple times throughout the history of Hyrule. The main villain of the series, Ganon, also comes back through various means throughout the series, although not necessarily through reincarnation. Developers managed to make the world of Hyrule come to life with new characters and diverse locations. Hyrule favorites like Kakariko Village make their first appearances here. The gameplay took the best parts of the original Zelda and refined it to almost perfection. The dungeons felt more unique, the puzzles more varied, the combat more fleshed out, and the art design looked fantastic. Series mainstays like the Master Sword, the Hookshot, and Pieces of Heart were introduced with this release. Also, this was the first game where players learned that they shouldn't attack the cuckoos. A Link to the Past had an interesting mechanic which let players switch back and forth between the two versions of the game world. This parallel universe concept has been seen in many games since, including future Zelda titles. A Link to the Past performed well both financially and critically. Plenty of Zelda fans find A Link to the Past to be the best Zelda game ever released, although that remains a widely debated topic. What isn't debated is how influential this game ended up being for the future of the series. Fans did not have to wait long for Link's next outing, this time available on a portable console. The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening shifted backwards into the 8-bit realm on the monochromatic Game Boy system. Once again directed by Takashi Tezuka, the game served as a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, though it didn't take place in Hyrule. Instead, it takes place on Koholint Island after Link shipwrecks there. Even with the downgrade in specs on the handheld, the developers were able to incorporate many of the elements that made A Link to the Past great into Link's Awakening. For instance, Link's Awakening features a quality narrative and introduces a variety of offbeat and quirky characters. The dungeons in this game are made to feel more unique than in A Link to the Past, achieved by giving each their own distinct music, a first for the series. Though the majority of the game is played in an overhead view, there were periodic side-scrolling sections reminiscent of Zelda 2. Nintendo's other properties even make appearances throughout the game, such as a Chain Chomp, Goombas, Yoshi, and even Kirby. Even weirder is that Koholint Island took inspiration from the fictitious town of the beloved American television show Twin Peaks. Takashi Tezuka said, "At the time, Twin Peaks was rather popular. The drama was all about a small number of characters in a small town. I wanted to make something that, while it would be small enough in scope to easily understand, it would have deep and distinctive characteristics."
You know, this is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
A colorized version of the game released on the Game Boy Color a few years later, named Link's Awakening DX. Link's Awakening ended up selling very well. Even better than A Link to the Past if you combine the sales from both releases. At this point, it seemed like the boy in the green tunic could do nothing wrong. Unfortunately, he did. There is a lot of history surrounding the ill-fated Philips CDI console. Nintendo was to develop a CD add-on to the Super Nintendo with partners Sony and Philips. Ironically, it would have also been named the PlayStation if it was released, the name of Nintendo's biggest competitor today. Nintendo never commercially produced this add-on, but contractually, Philips was allowed to develop games for their own platform using Nintendo licenses. First there was Hotel Mario.
Nice of the princess to invite us over for a picnic, eh, Luigi? I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
Afterwards, there were not one, not two, but 3 Zelda games on the Philips CDI. First, there was the cartoonish Link: The Faces of Evil and Zelda: The Wand of Gamelon. This later evolved into the more realistic-looking Zelda's Adventure. Technically, Wand of Gamelon and Zelda's Adventure were the first games that let players control Zelda herself, although the appeal was limited. Faces of Evil and Wand of Gamelon both feature side-scrolling gameplay similar to Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, except it is a lot slower and clunkier. Zelda's Adventure had the more popular top-down perspective, but that didn't help it much. Luckily for Nintendo, the Philips CDI faded into obscurity, and these games didn't tarnish the Zelda brand much as a result.
How about a kiss for luck?
You've got to be kidding.
Long before the downloading of games became as mainstream as it is today, both Nintendo and Sega released their own versions of a downloadable game service. Nintendo's was called the Satellaview, and it allowed games to be streamed over to the console in an episodic nature. Unfortunately, the Satellaview was only available in Japan. Nintendo remade the original Zelda game for the service called BS: The Legend of Zelda, BS standing for Broadcast Satellite. Instead of Link, the protagonist was the player's own created avatar for the system. Due to the nature of the game being broadcasted to the system, it had to be played in one sitting, and it was only available for 1 hour each week. That wasn't the only Zelda game offered on the Satellaview though. BS: The Legend of Zelda Ancient Stone Tablets was also released during a month-long event in 1997. It acts almost as an expansion to A Link to the Past, but with an entirely new story and new dungeons. Each week, players were given 50 minutes to play through one of the game's 4 segments. Each segment had 2 dungeons that needed to be completed. If you didn't have enough time to complete the dungeons, you would be unable to return to them the following week. Also, this game allowed players to rent items temporarily instead of permanently obtaining them, which is a concept Nintendo would later return to. The Satellaview games, while an interesting experiment, didn't really bring the Zelda series forward in terms of innovation. Luckily, Nintendo had been hard at work creating a new Zelda game that would act as a prequel to all the other Zelda games that came before it on the newly released Nintendo 64 console. Zelda 64, later renamed to Ocarina of Time, was in development for about 4 years, which was completely unparalleled for Nintendo at the time. Newcomer to the series, Eiji Aonuma directed the game. Throughout the development, Nintendo showed off plenty of footage that differs greatly from the product we ended up receiving. As this was the beginning of the console 3D era, there wasn't much of a template to make games like Zelda work with the new perspective. In the beginning, Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time were being developed in conjunction. As a result, they influenced one another considerably. Instead of just making a 3D version of a top-down Zelda game, Nintendo decided to go the route paved by Mario 64 with its camera. Since Ocarina of Time wasn't just a platformer, they invented a target lock mechanic, which they named Z-targeting, to make combat work in this new dimension. When players lock their camera onto the enemy, they don't have to struggle with losing them off screen. While this may seem commonplace today for a lot of 3D action games, this was completely revolutionary for the time. As the player rode their horse Epona across Hyrule Field, the world felt much more vast than it did in A Link to the Past. Although it did not have the light and dark world mechanic from the previous game, this new Link travels back and forth through time, experiencing the game as a child and as an adult. With the transition to 3D, the developers could venture deeper into the storytelling department. The game had some great pacing, memorable characters, and fantastic cinematography. Not to mention one of gaming's best soundtracks that is sure to stick in players' minds forever. On the gameplay side, when players weren't exploring the overworld, there were great dungeon designs filled with fun puzzles to break up the combat of the game. Ocarina of Time also introduced plenty of races that we associate with Hyrule today, like the Gorons, Sheikah, Kokiri, and Gerudos. One of the Gerudos introduced is the antagonist Ganondorf, which is the human form of Ganon from the previous games. Upon release, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was almost universally greeted by exceptional reviews. Unsurprisingly, it sold better than any previous Zelda game at the time, and to this day is still viewed as one of the greatest games ever made. To follow up on Ocarina of Time's success, the original plan was to create an expanded version of the game called Ura Zelda for the Nintendo 64 DD, or Disk Drive system. The game was reported to include alternate and more difficult dungeons and new enemies. Nintendo was also working on another expansion called Zelda Gaiden, which was to be a side story for Link in a new overworld, which reused the assets from Ocarina of Time. Due to the failure of the 64 DD, Nintendo had to rethink what they were going to do with these projects. Years later, the remnants of Zelda turned into The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time Master Quest. As for Zelda Gaiden, Nintendo quickly turned it into a cartridge-based direct sequel to Ocarina of Time called The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask. Once again, Eiji Aonuma helmed the director's seat. Majora's Mask featured similar gameplay to Ocarina of Time, but it also had a few big mechanic differences. As Link explores the new land of Termina, he has to contend with a Groundhog Day-like 3-day in-game cycle. Once the third day hits, a very angry moon will crash onto the planet, and Link will need to reset time over and over again until he is prepared to stop the threat. Majora's Mask wants players to learn the timeline of events and follow the story of many NPCs scattered across the world during these 3 days. Due to this, Majora's Mask is much more side quest nature than the other games. Majora's Mask marks the first appearance of the creepy looking map merchant named Tingle. To assist him on his journey, Link collects an arsenal of masks that give him certain abilities. There are a few transformation masks that let Link turn into the different races of Hyrule, like the Deku, Goron, and Zora. Also, the fan favorite Fierce Deity mask was awarded to players who could collect all the other masks in the game. The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask has a much darker tone than its predecessors. The game is themed around death and dealing with grief. There are moments in the game that feel very eerie and uncomfortable, which makes Majora's Mask stand out in comparison to the other Zelda games. Even though Majora's Mask didn't sell or review as well as the last few major releases, it has held onto a very loyal cult following over the years. Years earlier, Link's Awakening and Link's Awakening DX proved that the Zelda formula worked very well in a portable format, which inspired Nintendo to continue creating 8-bit handheld adventures. For the first time in the series, Nintendo decided to outsource the games to another developer. They placed their faith into Capcom and Flagship Games to develop a trilogy of companion games that would interact with each other. The idea proved to be a bit too ambitious, so they scaled it back to a duo of games named The Legend of Zelda: Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Each game had a major mechanic to make themselves more distinguishable. Oracle of Ages let players travel through time, where Oracle of Seasons had puzzles that were time sensitive due to the change of the seasons. For dedicated fans who purchased both titles, they could link the two games together to affect the world of the second game played. Overall, Nintendo outsourcing the series to Capcom for a couple of titles seemed like a good move while Nintendo was working on the next big 3D Zelda game. Before the launch of the Nintendo GameCube, they showed off a tech demo of how a Zelda game could look on that new hardware. After Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, this tech demo made fans excited for what another Zelda title could be with this graphic fidelity. What fans got in the end was definitely not what they were expecting. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker brought forward a very ambitious new cel-shaded art style which showcased a much younger protagonist in a vibrant, colorful world. Over the years, this design of Link has been nicknamed Toon Link. This art style change had its critics at the time, with some nicknaming the game Zelda, but there is no denying how well the art style for the game has aged. There is even an argument to be made that this was the best looking incarnation for Ganondorf in the entire series. The world of Wind Waker is much different than what players experienced in the previous games. Instead of exploring Hyrule via means of walking or on a horse, players had a massive ocean to explore on a boat. Throughout the ocean, Link will find a bunch of smaller and remote islands with plenty of secrets to discover. Although these design changes were controversial, many found the Wind Waker a breath of fresh air for the series. Nintendo made a game that was unlike anything that was made at the time. Between the amazing sense of adventure, great atmosphere, and the fantastic music, Nintendo was able to pull off another classic. Unfortunately though, the Wind Waker didn't sell nearly as well as earlier games like Ocarina of Time. This isn't a mark against the quality of the product though, it was more due to the fact that the GameCube itself did not do as well as previous Nintendo consoles. Nintendo wasn't done with Toon Link after the Wind Waker released. With a port of A Link to the Past on the GBA, Nintendo created a bonus game called Four Swords. They expanded on the Four Swords ideas with the GameCube spin-off called The Legend of Zelda Four Swords Adventures. This game let players link their Game Boy Advances to the GameCube to take on Ganon with friends. For those wanting more of a single-player experience, they can play the game without a Game Boy Advance connected. Four Swords Adventures was definitely an interesting experiment in the Zelda series, and you can see how this game could have been a bit of the inspiration that went into the Wii U many years later. Around this time, Eiji Aonuma became the official producer over the entire Zelda franchise. After doing directorial work on Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and The Wind Waker, he seemed more than qualified for the job. To this day, he has had a hand in every single Zelda game since Ocarina of Time, as either a producer, director, or supervisor. Shigeru Miyamoto also continued working on the franchise in a producer role as well. After the successful Oracle games, Nintendo outsourced Zelda out to Capcom once again to create another full-length Zelda title on the Game Boy Advance. The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap, had elements from the art style we saw from The Wind Waker, but brought it back to the traditional overhead view. The hook for the Minish Cap is that Link can now turn almost microscopically small in certain situations to solve puzzles with the help of his hat named Eslo. Aonuma said, "Our first approach was to take our early image sketches and try to convert them to 2D graphics on the Game Boy Advance. One picture showed a tiny creature in a barrel and a tiny Link. Another picture showed a corridor made out of the gaps between normal-sized furniture and an unknown world opening up beyond. Stuff like that. Once we saw those images, we could feel this is going to be an interesting game." The Minish Cap was well received critically, but it didn't exactly set the world on fire like the previous entries. In fact, it sold less than every main series Zelda game at that point. If you look at the timeline of releases, about 1 to 2 Zelda games were coming out almost every year since the new millennium hit, which could be a reason why it didn't sell as well. Gamers weren't exactly starved for a new Zelda title. When Nintendo revealed the next 3D Zelda game, fans were seriously ecstatic. Just listen to them. Many were looking for a darker Zelda title, more in vein of Link's Nintendo 64 adventures, and it looked like The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess was going to deliver. In fact, Twilight Princess proved to be even darker in tone than Ocarina of Time ever was, although it followed the game's footsteps in a lot of ways. For instance, Epona, Link's trusty steed from Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, makes a return in Twilight Princess. Not only that, but it is believed that the Hero Shade character that teaches the new Link sword techniques might actually be the Hero of Time from the Nintendo 64 games. Throughout Twilight Princess, Link will transform into a wolf once he enters an area infected by the Twilight. Playing as Wolf Link varied up the gameplay a bit and added a unique twist on the Zelda formula. That wasn't the only twist though, since Twilight Princess was the first Zelda game to release on 2 Nintendo consoles, the GameCube and the Wii, within a few weeks of each other. On the Nintendo Wii, they were able to add motion controls for Link when he swings his sword. Due to the fact that the majority of the world is right-handed, but Link in the past always was left-handed, the developers decided to mirror the whole game on the Wii console. Aiming weapons like the bow used pointer controls from the infrared sensor on the Wii remote, which felt very natural. The gamble to release this game on both consoles worked very well, as Twilight Princess became the killer app behind Wii Sports for the Wii's very successful launch. The game did well both financially and critically. Some critics noted that the motion controls for the sword on the Wii version felt tacked on, and the visuals didn't seem as impressive for a game released on a new console. Miyamoto himself was a bit critical about Twilight Princess, citing that he felt it was missing something. Regardless, the game proved to be a worthwhile adventure with a great story and some of the best dungeons we have ever seen in franchise history. With the release of the Wii Zapper a couple years later, Nintendo made a shooter spin-off called Link's Crossbow Training that came with the accessory and used the assets from Twilight Princess. It was a short but sweet arcade-like experience that fit the Wii Zapper well. Even after showing a more realistic art style with Twilight Princess, Nintendo wasn't done with Toon Link still. The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass was a direct sequel to the Wind Waker, but now with an overhead view on the Nintendo DS. Phantom Hourglass controlled quite a bit differently than the Zelda titles before it. Instead of using the traditional controls that were available, the player would exclusively control Link using the bottom touchscreen on the Nintendo DS. At the time, this was a pretty controversial choice. Looking back, this style of play was much ahead of its time considering how mobile gaming has changed due to the touchscreens on our phones. Even with the radically different controls, it was still very much a Zelda game. It added a nice sense of exploration by letting players draw on their map to mark locations that they should visit and also to make notes. Some of the mechanics from the Wind Waker make their return, like controlling a boat in a vast ocean. Unlike the Wind Waker though, the player simply charts out a path for the boat to take automatically, leaving the player to concentrate on defending itself until they arrive. Upon release, the game performed well critically and financially. Phantom Hourglass actually managed to sell twice as well as Link's previous portable outing, the Minish Cap. It wasn't too long afterwards that Nintendo started working on a sequel to Phantom Hourglass named The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. This was set in a new Hyrule that took place 100 years after the events of The Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass. Much like how The Wind Waker incorporated boat travel, Spirit Tracks was heavily based around a new concept for the Zelda series, train travel. Once off the train, the gameplay is very similar to Phantom Hourglass. This game might be the most apt one to be called The Legend of Zelda. Throughout the game, the spirit of Zelda works as your personal guide, and she can also possess the phantoms around her. By possessing the phantoms, she can offer both offensive and defensive backup for Link. She can also be used to solve various puzzles inside a reoccurring dungeon in the game. Considering that Zelda is a relatively minor role in most of the canon releases in the franchise, this was an interesting change to see. Upon release, the game did not perform as well as Phantom Hourglass before it. These two Nintendo DS games proved to be an interesting experiment in the Zelda franchise. Nintendo has shown that they are very willing to try new and varied concepts when it comes to making new games in the series, even when it comes to basic things like control. Nintendo is far from done experimenting with how we interact with our video games. Tingle, a fan favorite character most notably from Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker, had a slew of spin-off games that weren't available in America. Freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land was the first to release, followed by the Club Nintendo exclusive Tingle's Balloon Fight DS, and lastly, ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. Rosy Rupee Land had some elements of puzzle solving and dungeon exploring we were used to from the Zelda series. Balloon Fight DS was essentially a remake of the original Balloon Fight from the NES. Balloon Trip of Love was a bit more unique since it was a point-and-click game set as a parody of The Wizard of Oz. Fans had to wait about 5 years for the next big 3D Zelda game to release for the Nintendo Wii, directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi. While Twilight Princess introduced basic motion controls, the game was primarily a GameCube release that was ported to the Wii. Plenty of people wondered how a Zelda game would be if it was developed solely to work with the Wii's strengths. At E3 2010, fans got their first glimpse at The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Using the Wii Motion Plus accessory, Skyward Sword let players control the sword one-to-one with the Wii remote. Some enemies require the player to slash horizontally or vertically to fight them. Due to this, it is very important for the player to read the enemy's stance and decide what type of sword swing they should use. Simply swinging wildly like the player might have done on Twilight Princess just wouldn't work out. Aonuma said, "We had Motion Plus, and when that technology came out, we wanted to implement it in Zelda, and so we started looking at the sword. To be honest with you, we weren't able to get the effectiveness we were looking for, and we tried some different ways to implement it, and it really wasn't going well for us. And we actually decided that we're not going to put in Motion Plus, let's just move on with something else." But then Wii Sports Resort came out, and its swordplay mode used Wii Motion Plus really well. So then we said, wait a minute, you can actually implement it in a way that allows people to use that sword very freely and very naturally. So we went and talked with the development team, and we were able to borrow some of their technology and then put it back into The Legend of Zelda. There were plenty of other additions to the gameplay with the motion controls, like throwing versus rolling a bomb on the ground depending on how you move the Wii Remote. Instead of a horse, or a boat, or a train, Link can now navigate the clouds above Hyrule using his Loftwing, which is a giant bird he can ride on. When not riding on his bird, Link can run for a limited time without using an item with the introduction of a stamina meter. True to Zelda tradition, this new game had a completely new watercolor-esque art style that made the world feel like it was hand-painted. Along with that, this was the first game in the franchise to have fully orchestrated music. Skyward Sword is set as the earliest game in the Zelda timeline. For those people interested in the Zelda timeline, Dark Horse released a book the same year that Skyward Sword came out that showcased the timeline. If anyone watching this video doesn't know how the Zelda games connect with one another, I'd recommend either buying the Hyrule Historia book or watching the various YouTube videos dedicated to explaining the timeline. When released, Skyward Sword didn't sell as well as most of the 3D Zelda titles before it, although it mostly received the critical praise that the Zelda series has been known for. Time hasn't been very kind for Skyward Sword, as a lot of people find it to be the weakest 3D Zelda game. Common complaints were that the new control system didn't work as well as some people would like. Inversely, there was also plenty of people who had never had an issue with the controls whatsoever and welcomed the change to the formula. Some people complained that the sky was less interesting to explore than what we have seen in the past for the Zelda series. The developers at Nintendo surely heard this complaint and kept it in mind to make exploring the world interesting and rewarding for the next console-bound Zelda title. Before that game would come to fruition, Nintendo started developing titles for the Nintendo 3DS. First was a remake of Ocarina of Time for the 3DS. This remake had better visuals and some better quality of life features. They also added the Master Quest mode from before with a mirrored twist, similar to the Wii version of Twilight Princess. A few years later, they gave Majora's Mask the same treatment also on the 3DS. The handheld wasn't the only system to see other Zelda titles make a comeback. On the Wii U, gamers were able to experience an HD version of the Wind Waker. Another few years later, an HD version of Twilight Princess also made its way to store shelves. Unlike a lot of other ports or remakes that we see in the gaming industry, Nintendo really spent their time with each game and tried to fix some of its shortcomings. In between all these remakes and HD remastered ports, Nintendo was working on an original Zelda game for the Nintendo 3DS, or at least a loosely original Zelda game. The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds is a sequel to A Link to the Past, so much so that they remade the entire map from the original game. In Japan, the name of the game is actually called The Legend of Zelda: Triforce of the Gods 2, since Triforce of the Gods was the name of A Link to the Past in that region. Instead of traveling through the light and dark world versions of Hyrule, Link now travels between Hyrule and Lorule. Nintendo went back to the traditional controls from the other overhead Zelda games with this title. There were a few mechanics added to A Link Between Worlds that set it apart from the other Zelda titles. The first was a wall merging mechanic that let Link traverse as a painting on most of the walls on the game. This proved to be a fun mechanic for puzzle solving. A Link Between Worlds also added the ability to rent all the items you need for dungeons from a shop in the overworld. This is a pretty big feature since it allows for a lot more freedom in the order the player can complete the dungeons in the game. Aonuma said, "In previous Zelda games, we created the scenarios and linked them together in a line. But ultimately, that becomes super linear. I think that's not really that much fun. What I wanted to do with this new game, A Link Between Worlds, is to be able to give the players lots of choices and let them be able to think about things for themselves." A Link Between Worlds did very well critically. Nintendo's risk on changing the structure that so many Zelda games had relied on for so many years was a success. Around this time, Nintendo gave Koei Tecmo the reins to create a Zelda title on the Wii U in the same vein as their Dynasty Warriors franchise. Hyrule Warriors didn't play like most of the other Zelda titles, as it was much more focused on large-scale battles. It let players control a huge roster of Zelda characters from the whole franchise. It proved to be a very fun spin-off full of references to the whole series that longtime fans would enjoy. Later in its lifespan, the game would be ported to the Nintendo 3DS and the Switch with additional content. It didn't take long for Nintendo to develop another Zelda game in the same vein as A Link Between Worlds. The Legend of Zelda Triforce Heroes was very reminiscent of the Four Swords games. The game was developed around the idea of 3-player co-op action, though it could also be played solo. Multiplayer was much easier this time around due to the wireless capabilities of the Nintendo 3DS instead of the massive link cables on the GameCube and the GBA. Between their experiments on the 3DS, Nintendo was in a good position to make a truly different and revolutionary new title for the series. The first trailer for a new Zelda game on the Wii U was shown at E3 2014. It showcased a very different looking Link and a gorgeous new open world. Though The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was originally intended to be released in 2015, multiple delays saw the game's release in 2017 alongside the Nintendo Switch's launch. During development, the dev team created a 2D style prototype in the vein of the original Legend of Zelda to test out ideas. Since the game heavily focused on open world interactivity, this proved to be a good test bed for the developers to use. Much like A Link Between Worlds, this new game proved to be a lot less linear than the previous entries in the franchise. Within the first hour or two of the game, the player is presented with all the tools he will need to complete all the puzzles in the game. If the player wanted to rush over to complete the final dungeon and defeat the final boss right at the beginning of the game, they could. Returning game director Hidemaru Fujibayashi said, "After working on Skyward Sword, we took in a lot of feedback from fans, as well as what producer Eiji Aonuma had been thinking, along with myself. And then we came up with this concept of really breaking conventions, and also we were looking to create the next iteration of Zelda. It all kind of lined up to create this new direction. What sets Breath of the Wild apart from a lot of open world games of the modern era is the very intelligent use of sightlines. The world was designed in such a way that there is almost always something interesting to see and explore in the distance. The game introduces the concept of shrines hidden all over the vast landscape of Hyrule. These shrines act as mini dungeons that give players the chance to upgrade their health or stamina meter upon completion. There are bigger dungeons in the game, but there aren't as many as there are in most of the other 3D Zelda titles. Much like Triforce Heroes before it, Link can don many types of clothing or armor options with their own unique abilities. Breath of the Wild also acted voice acting for the first time in a canon Zelda title, though I don't know if it matches the high bar of quality from the CDI titles. Here, you can be the judge.
Link, you are our final hope. The fate of Hyrule rests with you.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
Breath of the Wild proved to be a huge success upon release. It was the killer app that the Nintendo Switch needed during its launch. Currently, Breath of the Wild holds a sales record when compared to the rest of the franchise. The Wii U version of the game ended up being the last Nintendo-produced game to release on that console. Critically, the game did very well, with some people calling it one of the best games ever made. A few years later, indie developer Brace Yourself Games created a spin-off title called Cadence of Hyrule. This took the rhythm gameplay from Brace Yourself's previous work, Crypt of the Necrodancer, and mixed it with the Zelda franchise, primarily A Link to the Past. Since the Zelda franchise is known for its fantastic music, this mashup was a match made in heaven. Between the Capcom Zelda titles, Hyrule Warriors and Cadence of Hyrule, Nintendo's experiments handing off the Zelda reins to other developers have proven to be very successful. Where does the franchise go from here? In February 2019, Nintendo announced a remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch. The game showcases another fantastic new art style that the series can explore. This game is set to be released on September 20th, 2019. At E3 2019, Nintendo launched a teaser trailer for a sequel to Breath of the Wild. This trailer had a much darker tone than the original Breath of the Wild, so it will be interesting to see where Nintendo takes that game. We don't have a launch date or an official title for the game as of yet. The Legend of Zelda is a franchise that lives up to its name. It is a true legend for the gaming industry. Throughout the last 30 years, the series brought forth so much innovation to how we play video games now. Millions upon millions of players across the globe have donned the green tunic to embark on a grand adventure full of discovery and wonder. it has been able to maintain its relevance across multiple generations of people and is showing no signs of slowing. It is a series that taught us that, although it is dangerous to go alone, courage will help you see it through. Thank you everybody for watching. This is the 4th From Pixels to Polygons video I have made, so if you're interested in learning the history of other franchises, go ahead and click on the channel and watch some of the other videos. Currently we have one for Metroid, Metal Gear, and Resident Evil. If you have any suggestions for videos you would like for us to make in the future, go ahead and send us a suggestion at the listed email on the screen. Thanks for watching.